Good morning, folks. Can you hear me out there? It is Wednesday, the 8th of March, 2023. My name is Jason Bruce, your host with the Honks. This is Crypto Clown World. And if you haven't already, make sure that you're honking that like button, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell for notifications if you haven't, so that you are notified for these streams and timely upload content. With that in mind, we are jumping into the DXY. And right now, DXY is trying to correct after a pretty fast run up yesterday while Powell was talking. So it has been consolidating since then. It is actually severely oversold on the 1 hour. However, it is just breaking support. So when we zoom out here on the 4-hour picture, it looks like the dollar is ready to roll over, at least temporarily right now, try and come back and find some support around the middle of this range. So you can see that we have actually established a pretty strong hidden bearish divergence with this swing up on the RSI to swing up in price action, higher swing up in price action, and a lower swing up on the RSI. So this is a positive sign right now. And really what this tells us is that we can see more downwards action for the dollar, which should actually be positive for the ES1, S&P, E-mini futures. Just a sec here, folks. All right. So let's jump over to the S1. And you can see here we have been consolidating after making this nice three-wave set up. And this consolidation did come back down to this golden pocket area. And right now we are creating some bullish divergence in an attempt to continue moving up. This is the next target area that I have established here, is this larger golden pocket, which corresponds to this low and this high on the Fibonacci. Of course, my music isn't cooperating this morning. Why would it? Just lovely. All right, so really what we're looking for is a break out of this consolidation. We have this point of control at around this 39.92 area. I want to see us close the day above 4,000, above this pattern that we had been working in here that we did briefly dip down below and break out of, and now have broken back into. This 1 hour stochastics RSI is a little bit troublesome. But if we zoom out, we can see here that we're very low on the 4 hour, and that should give us potential for some room to the upside. So that's what we're looking for and hoping for this morning for the S&P before Powell gets to squawk in here in a little bit. We do have a similar picture going on for Bitcoin. All right. So we are consolidating here after a little bit of a dump down from this support area. Our point of control is sitting in the middle of that support area at around 22,377. So that's the area I'd like to negotiate. If we can get back above this 22,377, 22,392-ish area with a 4-hour candle closure, we can see Bitcoin start to pick up some momentum. Right now on the 1 hour, these moving averages are pretty tight, with price action just below the 7 EMA, middle Bollinger Band just above that, 25 EMA just above that, and the 99 EMA sitting here just below that point of control that I highlighted, and just above the upper Bollinger Band. So we just want to see this divergence continue to play out for Bitcoin this morning on the 1 hour chart. Take a quick look at Ethereum, and we do see a pretty similar picture to what we did for Bitcoin. Alright, so we just want to stay above these levels. I don't want to see any more wicks down. I want to see this consolidation build into a base on this smaller time frame, and we want Ethereum to be able to take out this point of control around 1568, 1569. Get a 4-hour closure above that level. We can potentially see Ethereum move up this morning. So something to highlight right now, XRP did have a bit of a breakout just above wick just above this 200 daily moving average. I did highlight the possibility that it could gravitate towards that on the stream yesterday, and right now looks like potentially a bit of a rejection on the 1 hour and potential consolidation from that area. What I'd like to see is to establish support above this structure here, or at the very least this structure here, okay, which could retest this point of control, and that would remain bullish on this breakout move here. Okay, this doesn't look all bad for XRP right now, as it is trying to establish this trending breakout move. I believe it's important to highlight what the Bitcoin pair is doing as well. We do see some similarities, however, here we do see some hidden bearish divergence. So I do expect a correction in the short term for XRP BTC. See, we're overbought on the 4-hour time frame as well, and making this wick here, so likely to correct again in the short term. It's positive to see the price action above this point of control. It's possible that maybe we see some consolidation, come back down here, form a bit of a cup and a handle action, maybe bounce off of this point of control, and then finally come back up to make a larger trending move for XRP BTC. So right now we just want to see the larger markets hold their current structure. And as we zoom in, it looks like S&P might actually be losing a little bit of momentum here. Below this line right here, around 39.77, the next major supports again are the 200 daily moving average around 39.50, and this purple line of support, which was resistance on the macro for the past year, that's around 39.34. I really don't want to see us retest this again, as we have retested it a few times recently. as you can see here and here. So I would like price action to stay above that. Any sort of retest I would like to see remain in this pattern and close to this golden pocket, or at the very lowest this 706 institutional Fibonacci. Really kind of important to me that we hold this point of control here, which we are trying to move under right now. So that's around 39.91. Really, once again, psychological level is 4,000. I would like to see price maintain above that. We are seeing a battle here right now for that level. I'd like to see the price for Bitcoin move back above 22K just within the short term. This 12-minute time frame is showing us that possibly we get a move up here in the short term. Let's see, we've got a little bit of a bullish divergence playing out here. So the hope is this would gain more momentum. Powell will be speaking shortly, in less than 10 minutes here. We can just get Bitcoin back above 22K right now in the super short term. That will be a positive move. And S&P is trying to lose it now. It's going to be a battle here over the next few minutes and hours as Powell does get ready to take the stand. And we are potentially seeing a battle at the point of control for both the S&P and for Bitcoin. So kind of some weak green candles here. This is really not showing me strength. It's like the fact that this RSI is trying to turn up on this smaller time frame, and that we do have this divergence here. And we're still trying to hold the line for the S&P. See if I can find a live broadcast for you folks. So that we can flip over to the Fed chair here in just a moment. Had a bit of a hard time finding a stream yesterday as well. Just trying to find a stream here for the Fed. And YouTube really isn't giving us too much here this morning. Alright, I think we got it now. So we should be ready to kick over to the Fed chair in just a couple minutes. And we're still trying to see the S&P dig itself out. It's very tight right now, waiting for Mr. Powell. Bitcoin trying to push back above 22. These wicks here hitting that point of control. Very tight action. Very tight action. And this is probably likely to stay tight until we get something definitive out of Powell. Let's just kind of look at this real quick as to what the potential pattern might be. So it really is, you know, pretty symmetrical, kind of like we've been seeing. The measured move down would be fairly drastic. So if we get a breakdown from that point of control, go all the way down here to about 21,350. Definitely heard people talking about that target. And then potential upside. If they like something the Fed chair says, 22.5, just to get back up to this range. All right. So let's kick it over to Fed Chair Powell, and we'll see what's going on. And it doesn't look like he's quite ready yet. They were just a minute or two late yesterday. Yep, we're just waiting on the Fed here. So let's continue to take a look while we're waiting on him here. We are seeing a little bit of a wick down now. Let's see if that turns into a bounce back up, maybe a little bit of a fake out, or if this is going to gain momentum. Sure what we're waiting on here. Does seem like quite a few people waiting.
Today, Grayscale and the SEC head to court over a Bitcoin ETF. The SEC also faces pushback from a
That's
judge
something
in
we can talk
Voyager's
about real
bankruptcy
quick.
proceedings.
This
And Morgan McKenna,
hearing with the
Providence
SEC
Blockchain
over
Foundation,
Grayscale
reveals
trying
how
to push
TradFi could
the
embrace blockchain technology.
spot Bitcoin ETF has been going on for quite a while. For whatever reason, our government does not want that to happen, essentially because it would allow custody of Bitcoin to a larger audience, which they really just don't want. So got all kinds of stuff coming up here. Not sure why they're not ready yet. Let's see. If there's anything going on here. He should be testifying to the House right now. So these are actually positive numbers in terms of what they're looking for. Trade balance came in lower than expected, which economically is strong, and the unemployment is higher than the forecast, which they did want higher unemployment. Or excuse me, that's ADP employment, so that's higher than the forecast. That's actually not good. They want higher unemployment and lower employment. So the Fed isn't going to like that. People are working and making money. How dare they? How dare they? So not sure why that one isn't working. Let's try this one. And yeah, they just have not gotten going yet. Okay. They just have not gotten it going yet. Chat is disabled for CNBC's live stream. That's so boring. I guess they just don't care that people don't like to hear the narrative or that people have an opinion on things. They just want to shovel the pablum into your mouth. This is very rude of Mr. Powell to make us wait this morning. I'd rather be in bed, to be completely honest. Let's flip over to Bitcoin. And this is honestly telling us all that we need to see and hear, because we are getting this wick up. It's creating a higher low. And if we get a nice move out of this little symmetrical pattern, which it looks like we will. Oh, here we go.
Extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record, and I'll note at the outset that this hearing has a hard extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record, and I'll note at the outset that this hearing has a
well, that's a snazzy bow tie, mister.
For the Fed chair, and which we intend to strictly observe. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. Thank you, Chairman Powell, for your testimony today. This week, you stated that the Fed will, quote, stay the course until the job is done, and that is to restore price stability. This is positive. But you know as well as I do, you're facing a very strong headwind from the political left. Democrats are pressuring the Fed to stray from its narrow mandate. It's a page out of their same old progressive playbook. When they don't have the votes to achieve something here in Congress, they turn to regulators. And now, Chair Powell, they're looking at you and the Federal Reserve. President Biden's kowtowing to the far left is what got us into this inflationary mess. I urge you to reject the ideologues who put their social agenda ahead of economic prosperity. High prices continue to eat away at workers' wages and retirees' incomes. Since President Biden took office, we've experienced inflation at rates not seen since the late 70s and early 80s. Inflation rapidly accelerated after Democrats passed their so-called American Rescue Plan, which poured nearly $2 trillion of inflationary fuel into the economy. By June of last year, the Consumer Price Index showed inflation skyrocketed from below 2% to nearly 9%. And personal consumption expenditures, the Fed's preferred measure of consumer prices, ballooned to 7%. Instead of being rescued by Democrats, Americans were punished with pain at the grocery store and sticker shock at the pump. While inflation is now below its mid-2022 peak, it is persisting at rates well above the Fed's target. It remains broad-based and continues to hammer Americans' pocketbooks. In fact, a recent Gallup poll shows half of the respondents say they are worse off financially than a year ago. It's clear that there's still a long way to go in the effort to bring down costs. I look forward to hearing you reaffirm your commitment to that work today. Republicans also want to hear from you regarding some concerning developments at the Federal Reserve on the regulatory front. Recently, the Federal Reserve's Vice Chair for Supervision announced a quote-unquote holistic review of bank capital in the Fed's regulatory regime. However, it seems that only a small group within the Fed knows what this means, what it entails, how much review is being vetted by the full board, and the type of quantitative analysis the Fed is performing. The Fed shouldn't operate in the shadows, especially when the regulation in question can have broad and significant economic effects. It's also unclear the motivation for the Fed's holistic review, particularly when so many board members have stated that the banking system is very well capitalized, and any review of capital standards should be targeted. It also appears the Federal Reserve Board is laying the groundwork for climate policy to be implemented through the Fed regulation with an opening salvo to quote-unquote scenario analysis. Addressing an issue like climate change is important, but a policy that should originate here in Congress by the elected representatives of the people, not the central bank. As you said, the Fed needs to...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Chair Powell. Since your last visit, our country, under the leadership of President Biden, has made major progress to improve economic conditions, including adding a record 12 million jobs, reducing unemployment to its lowest rate in 54 years, while also reducing the deficit by $1.7 trillion. Unfortunately, many families are still struggling to afford basic necessities because of inflation. What's more, interest rate hikes are making borrowing, especially for mortgages, outrageously expensive. Since I raised this concern for you in a November letter, the rate hikes continue to have an outsized impact on housing costs, which are, as you know, a primary driver of core inflation. But, Mr. Chair, I think that you will agree that Congress also has a role. That's why I'm somewhat disappointed that after 2 months, Republicans have taken no serious action to address inflation. By this time last Congress, House Democrats had passed the American Rescue Plan to provide relief from the ongoing pandemic, which included our committee's efforts to provide $70 billion for homeowners, renters, businesses, and first responders. If Republicans are looking for ideas, committee Democrats have put forth additional bills, like the Build Back Better Act, to bring down costs for Americans, especially housing costs. Even more concerning, we're just months away from an economic catastrophe beyond what we have ever seen, including spiking interest rates, massive job losses, and global instability. I'm talking about the threats by Republican leadership to force a default on our nation's debt if we don't agree to their demands to cut Social Security, Medicare, or other critical programs. You've urged Congress to take immediate action to raise the debt ceiling. But rather than focusing on this very real issue, the first bill that committee Republicans brought to the floor instead suggested that Social Security and Medicare are socialist threats to America. Since then, we have considered legislation related to deregulating securities and banking laws and countering threats from China, but Republicans have completely ignored the
Whatever Mad Maxine is saying, we're getting some big green coming in here on Bitcoin right now.
Our economy defaulting on our debt. Last month, I wrote a letter to Chair McHenry urging him to take this matter seriously and hold a hearing, but I'm still waiting for a response. I hope Republicans will listen today to the real consequences that even the mere threat of a default would have for everyone in this country. And finally, I'm so pleased that we're finally making progress on diversity and inclusion for key positions at the Fed, including last year's historic confirmation of Dr. Lisa Cook to serve as the very first Black woman on the Federal Reserve Board, with the board's vice chair and Kansas City Fed president positions vacant. I think President Biden and Kansas City Fed Board should build on this progress by seriously considering diverse candidates for these positions. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The ranking member yields back the balance of my time, asking unanimous consent to submit for the record my letter to Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen from February 28th, asking for an update on the X-date for the debt ceiling. I also ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the latest CBO long-term budget outlook on the unsustainability of our debt, most recently released. And without objection, so ordered. I'll now recognize the Chair of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Barr, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Powell, thank you for being here today to discuss the Federal Reserve's monetary policy actions in a time of economic uncertainty, mixed economic data, historic inflation that continues to plague families and businesses around the country. It is paramount that the Federal Reserve remain vigilant on reducing inflation, anchoring inflation expectations, and restoring price stability at the Fed's 2% target. I also look forward to discussing the Fed's regulatory and supervisory activities. As the Fed reviews the bank capital framework, it needs to consider the impact to the real economy and our global competitiveness when raising capital requirements and sidelining capital would work at cross purposes with monetary tightening, constraining the supply side when we need more, not less, investment to fix supply chains and reduce inflation. Tailored regulations are required of the Fed by law, and a one-size-fits-all approach would be the wrong path to take. Finally, I urge the Fed, in your words, to stick to its knitting and not attempt to be a climate regulator. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Subcommittee, Mr. Foster, for 1 minute.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being here today. Today is the 15th anniversary of when I was first elected to Congress and placed on the Financial Services Committee, just as the economy was about to collapse. And so that was my trial by fire, the emergency response to rescue the economy and the legislative response, the Dodd-Frank Act, that successfully stabilized our financial system. So 15 years later, as I take my place as the ranking member on the Committee of Oversight over U.S. banking and monetary policy, I recall the solemn oath that I swore to myself back then to make sure that this kind of calamity never happens again. The monetary policy report that we're receiving today is largely a narrative of a return to normal. Lead times to manufacturers are back to pre-COVID levels. The job market retains supernatural strength, and inflation is responding more or less as predicted to the usual measures. And by far, the largest threat on the horizon is a repeat of the 2011 default crisis. Congress has the power to avoid that, and we owe it to the American people to do so. And I yield back.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Chair Powell was reappointed and sworn in for a second four-year term as chair on May 23, 2022. Chair Powell also serves as chairman of the Federal Open Markets Committee and the system's principal monetary policymaking, which is the system's principal monetary policymaking body. Chair Powell, we thank
people to do so, and I yield back.
Today, we welcome the testimony of Jerome Powell, Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Chair Powell was reappointed and sworn in for a second four-year term as chair on May 23, 2022. Chair Powell also serves as chairman of the Federal Open Markets Committee and the system's principal monetary policymaking, which is the system's principal monetary policymaking body. Chair Powell, we thank you for taking the time to be here. We will recognize you for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation or testimony. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Chairman Powell, you're recognized.
Chairman McHenry, Ranking Member Waters, and other members of the committee, good morning. And I appreciate the opportunity to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation is causing significant hardship, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal. Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Our policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. The data from January on employment, consumer spending, manufacturing production, and inflation have partly reversed the softening trends that we had seen in the data just a month ago. Some of this reversal likely reflects the unseasonably warm weather in January in much of the country. Still, the breadth of the reversal, along with the revisions to the previous quarter, suggest that inflationary pressures are running higher than expected at the time of our previous FOMC meeting. From a broader perspective, inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year, but remains well above our longer-run objective of 2%. The 12-month change in total PCE prices has slowed from its peak of 7% in June to 5.4% in January, as energy prices have declined and supply chain bottlenecks have eased. Over the past 12 months, core PCE inflation, which excludes the volatile food and energy prices, was 4.7%. As supply chain bottlenecks have eased and tighter policy has restrained demand, inflation in the core goods sector has fallen. And while housing services inflation remains too high, the flattening out in rents evident in recently signed leases points to a deceleration in this component of inflation over the year ahead.
Pretty dovish feel compared to yesterday.
This inflation thus far in the category of core services excluding housing, which accounts for more than half of core consumer expenditures. To restore price stability, we will need to see lower inflation in this sector, and there will very likely be some softening in labor market conditions. Although nominal wage gains have slowed somewhat in recent months, they remain above what is consistent with 2% inflation and current trends in productivity. Strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it's not eroded by inflation. Turning to growth, the U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. Although consumer spending appears to be expanding at a solid pace this quarter, other recent indicators point to subdued growth of spending and production. Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight. The unemployment rate was 3.4% in January, its lowest level since 1969. Job gains remain very strong in January, while the supply of labor has continued to lag. As of the end of December, there were 1.9 job openings for each unemployed individual, close to the all-time peak recorded last March, while unemployment insurance claims have remained near historic lows. Turning to monetary policy. With inflation well above our longer-run goal of 2% and with the labor market remaining extremely tight, the FOMC has continued to tighten the stance of monetary policy, raising interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the past year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee slowed the pace of interest rate increases over its past two meetings. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of the incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. Although inflation has been moderating in recent months, the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go and is likely to be bumpy. As I mentioned, the latest economic data have come in stronger than expected, which suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than previously anticipated. If, and I stress that no decision has been made on this, but if the totality of the data were to indicate that faster tightening is warranted, we'd be prepared to increase the pace of rate hikes. Restoring price stability will likely require that we maintain a restrictive stance of monetary policy for some time. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Federal Reserve will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of questioning. Chairman Powell, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 24 hours about the effect of rate increases on the economy, a lot of debate about what you said yesterday in the Senate. But no one asked you this directly. We have a March meeting coming up, Open Markets Committee meeting coming up in 2 weeks. How do you think about the March meeting? What's your approach to that? What are we likely to see?
Thank you. So I won't repeat what I just said in my testimony, but if I turn to the March meeting, I guess I would say that we have some potentially important data coming up, data to be analyzed. One of them came out at exactly 10 o'clock. That would be the JOLTS report, which, of course, I haven't seen, being sitting here at 10 o'clock. But we're also getting a jobs report on Friday and a CPI and PPI inflation report next week. So those will be important, and we'll scrutinize them. When we say that we're going to be looking at the totality of the data, which is what I said, that does include these reports yet to come. They're going to be important in our assessment of the higher readings that we have very recently received and of the overall direction of the economy and of our progress in bringing inflation down, and we'll be carefully analyzing them. Again, we have not made any decision about the March meeting. We're not going to do that until we see the additional data. The larger point, though, is that we're not on a preset path and that we will be guided by the incoming data and the evolving outlook.
But you've also said higher longer. Is that still the case?
Yes. So, as I said in my testimony, we look at the data since January and also the revisions to the November and December inflation data, and they suggest that the ultimate level of interest rates is likely to be higher than we'd expected.
What are those economic factors?
So going back to January, as I mentioned, the softer inflation readings of November and December were revised up. We got a very strong inflation report for January. We got an extraordinarily strong employment report, very strong consumer spending, strong manufacturing data right across the board. And as I pointed out, some of that may have been affected by the very warm January weather, but nonetheless, all of it pointed in the same direction.
Okay, let's move to regulation. Chair Powell, in January, the Federal Reserve put out a policy statement noting that digital asset custody is a permissible activity if done in a safe and sound manner. However, if a bank can demonstrate to the Fed that it can conduct that activity in safe and sound manner, the capital impact of the SEC's staff accounting bulletin effectively precludes banks from offering digital asset custody service at any scale. Are you aware of this staff accounting bulletin by the Securities Exchange Commission and its impact on custodial services?
I am aware of it. Of course, it's an SEC accounting bulletin. This is SAB 121, I think. And
that's right.
I'm certainly aware of it, and we do follow general accepted accounting principles in our
yes.
capital regulation.
Okay. Well, without objection, I'll submit for the record my letter to the bank regulators about this. So while the Fed says it can be done in a safe and sound manner, the Securities Exchange Commission has regulated it so that it cannot be done. Next question is certainly about bank capital standards. You got questions about this yesterday. Chair Barr has announced a holistic review of capital requirements. As I said in my opening statement, there are a lot of questions about this process. And previous statements by members of the Fed governors about the adequacy of current capital standards. And so while the Vice Chair for Supervision has announced that the Fed will engage in a holistic review of capital regulation, is that Fed staff? Is that done at the governor's, the board level? What is the process? There are a lot of questions that people have about his statements. And so we want to understand why it's necessary for the Fed to conduct a holistic review and what that process is. So, my general question is, do you still agree with your previous statements about the adequacy on a generalized basis of our financial system? Or are we to read into this that we're not adequately capitalized and there's a high level of risk in the system that we're unaware of at this point?
Thank you. So the why really just is that as a new Vice Chair for Supervision, Vice Chair Barr has launched into, he's taking a fresh look at everything, including capital. That actually is typical of the last two people to have this job. So that makes a lot of sense. In terms of the process, it's certainly conducted under Vice Chair Barr's leadership with input from the staff and discussions with governors on that committee. And I'm kept broadly apprised about what's going on. But the bottom line is nothing has been proposed to the board. Nothing has been formalized at this point. It's a lot of work that's going on. I think discussions are going on, meetings with industry and that kind of thing. When we get to the place where that's appropriate, the board will be carefully briefed. Ultimately, we'll vote on a proposal, and that proposal will go out for comment, and we'll solicit comment from any and all commenters, and we'll look very carefully at that. So it'll be a wide open process in the sunshine.
Thank you. I yield back. Now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much. Chair Powell, I agree with what you said on February 1st, that Congress must raise the debt limit because of what you described as the highly risky consequences of failing to do so. You are perhaps the most important expert on the debt limit, which is why I find it very concerning that your recommendation to raise the debt limit in a timely manner is being ignored by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I'm also concerned that the consequences of this brinksmanship are imminent. Fitch Ratings said this week they may seriously look at downgrading the U.S. debt based on the escalating brinksmanship they are observing, even if Congress ultimately addresses the debt limit at the last minute. This is history repeating itself. Standard & Poor's downgraded our debt back in 2011, when Republicans last controlled the House and threatened default. The Bipartisan Policy Center later found that the 2011 debt limit debate cost us $18.9 billion in higher borrowing costs, even though we never defaulted. To put that into perspective, that could have been leveraged to provide up to $200 billion in loans to small businesses through the state Small Business Credit Initiative, or to provide hundreds of thousands of people down payment assistance to buy their first home. So I want to emphasize that House Republicans, including most of the Republicans on this committee, had no qualms about paying our debts when Trump was in office. 3 times they addressed the debt ceiling in a timely manner without holding our country hostage. But Republicans are ready to tear down the hard work of Americans everywhere to weather the pandemic and build back a strong recovery. Chair Powell, can you describe for us the risk you see if Congress continues to delay action on the debt limit, both for our economy and for individuals and families?
Let me start briefly by saying that we have no role and seek no role in what is really at the heart of fiscal policy, except I will limit myself to the 2 things that other Fed chairs have said about this. One is just that Congress raising the debt ceiling is really the only alternative. There are no rabbits in hats to be pulled out on this. 2 really is just that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the non-payment of the government's bills, let alone a debt default or something of that nature, which we don't think will happen here. But no one should be thinking that we have the tools to protect the economy from all the potential effects of that.
Thank you very much. I don't want to miss what you said. I somewhat quoted you when you said that Congress must raise the debt limit because of what you described as a highly risky consequence of failing to do so. Is that your language?
Well, must in the sense that it's really the only way for the debt limit to be raised is Congress must act. Again, these are fiscal discussions, and we don't want to be a part of them. And,
they always want to talk about these unforeseen circumstances of not raising the debt ceiling, yet here we are dealing with all the circumstances of raising it over and over and over again, leading to rampant inflation, an undervalued currency, people having problems just paying their bills day to day, and effects on American businesses and all this other stuff. It's just so ridiculous that they won't take accountability for it and act like everything they do is so holy.
Mentioned that he had either written a letter or maybe even had some conversation from Janet Yellen about the time limits that she had attempted to describe. Is it your understanding that she said she could maneuver and kind of manipulate things so that she paid the bills that were coming due, but this could only last until about June? Is that your understanding?
Honestly, I would really have to not try to interpret the Secretary's words for you. That's really up to her to do.
Can she keep us afloat until about June?
I don't, honestly. That's not for me to say. These are really questions for the Secretary. I'm sorry, Ms. Waters.
Have you had any conversation with her about the statement that she made about being able to manipulate the debt and pay bills that were coming due out of another account, et cetera? Did you have that conversation with her?
The conversations that you and I have privately don't go anywhere. I don't talk about them with anybody, and the conversations I have with Secretary Yellen, I don't.
Okay, and I don't want to get
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady's time has expired.
Did I have equal time with you?
You sure did. He went over time.
If I did, thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize the Vice Chair of the full committee, Mr. Hill of Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us. You're welcome anytime. Don't wait till we ask. If you want to volunteer and come, we love having your views on many topics. Thanks for talking about your commitment to price stability. You know, we've had this discussion last June between us of, I do think that's the primary mission of the Fed, and I think it should be the only priority of the Fed is price stability. because it's the legislative branch and the executive branch that really are responsible for, quote, full employment and having that policy environment and making sure that that's right. So your commitment to price stability is welcome by this committee. Yesterday in the Senate, you suggested that you supported a regulatory framework, a broadly regulatory framework for digital assets. Is that right?
Yes.
And is it your view that if we had a regulatory framework here in the United States for digital assets, that there'd be more transparency and
here we
rules
go,
of the road
digital
for both
asset talk.
consumers,
Buckle up,
investors,
folks.
and developers?
Absolutely.
And would it, if we had those rules of the road for business seeking to use and develop blockchain as a potential new technology in their business and tokenized payments, that, again, that would be beneficial to business to know how to go about that?
Yes, and to assure that it's all done in a safe and sound manner when we're talking about banks.
Right. And then my next point would be exactly that, to help banks, investment brokers, custodians understand how they could even participate in that market in a safe and sound manner. You agree that a regulatory framework would help on that?
Yes.
And then finally, we've grown up in our country, and it's unique in the world, that we have a dual banking system. And due to a quirk here in Congress over 100 years ago, we have insurance is regulated exclusively by the states. So would you believe that that regulatory framework would also have to preserve some sort of role subject to safety and soundness, for states to play some role in that regulatory framework for digital assets?
Let me just say, I think that it certainly works in banking and insurance. I have no problem with those.
Right.
I'd have
But
to think
you,
about
you think it could, you consider it possible that it could also work in digital assets?
Certainly possible.
Yeah. Thank you. Turning to a topic that's been a subject here for nearly 4 years, central bank digital currencies. Article 1 of the Constitution reserves coins and coin issuance, money issuance to the Congress, and we've in turn delegated that to the U.S. Treasury, which has, since 1912, engaged the Federal Reserve as their fiscal agent. You've testified here many times before that to issue a central bank digital currency, that would have to be authorized by statute by Congress. Is that still your testimony? So
that is absolutely the case as it relates to a retail CBDC. There are potential forms of a wholesale CBDC that we need to look at. It's less clear. But we've always been talking about retail CBDC, and that's something we would certainly need congressional approval for.
And what would be a parameter on something that's not a retail CBDC where you think that could be issued in some form or fashion without Congress's direct statutory authorization?
It would be, for example, it would just be something between banks, so it would look an awful lot like a bank reserve. And you might ask, well, why would we need it? And that's a really good question too.
Yeah.
But just something that's literally within a wholesale market.
But that speaks that you might have a blockchain between banks and the Fed using a central bank digital currency token to settle transactions institutionally inside the yeah.
Yes.
So that leads me to FedNow, which is supposed to be up and running, I think, this summer, somewhat behind the scene there. I would like to ask you to formally have this full committee briefed on that by the Federal Reserve. I know the chair of the Kansas City Bank was involved. She's now left. And I think the committee has a lot of questions about FedNow, how its interoperability will work, how it's going to roll out, and also just a question that we've been asked, that why the Fed wire system isn't up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week now to benefit consumers that are using Venmo. Do you have a thought on that?
I'm not sure why we're not 24/7 on that, and we, of course, be delighted to come up and brief the committee on FedNow.
That'd be good. We'll take you up on that, and the right person from the Fed. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the the ranking member of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Mr. Sherman of California, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for bringing to our committee's attention several years ago the importance of tough legacy LIBOR, some $16 trillion of instruments where the creditor wouldn't know how much the debtor was supposed to pay. this committee, we passed legislation over a year before the LIBOR hit the fan. You issued regulations 7 months before the absolute deadline. I hope we do this in other areas, and it's my understanding that with those final regulations, we're done, and we've solved the LIBOR issue. Is that correct?
That's my understanding as well.
Good. People talk about inflation, and they somehow say that it's a matter of the personalities and politics in the United States. Others argue that the entire world is hit by inflation because Ukraine and COVID. I think we've got the answer to this question in that inflation is considerably higher in the Eurozone than it is in the United States today. And it's very hard to say that Joe Biden is responsible for inflation in Germany. I commend the ranking member for bringing up the debt limit and the harm that's already done to our economy. If we solve the problem tomorrow, we had less investment than we would have had yesterday. And I would say that I commend the president. He's going to issue a budget plan tomorrow. And perhaps in their time, one of our Republican colleagues can tell us when the Republican budget plan will be released. We are all eagerly awaiting it. Housing is a huge part of inflation, and we've left it to local government, but the permitting process there guarantees scarcity, which guarantees high housing costs. Mr. Chair, we've talked back in 2001 and several times even before that about wire fraud. And having just bought a home, I saw the process up front. Everybody's very nervous about one thing, and that is, will the buyer of the house be tricked into wiring their down payment to the wrong account? Or will the seller, the buyer be tricked or the escrow agent be tricked into sending the money to someone other than the seller of the property? We talked about this back in 2001, where I urged you with your FedNow system, which I'm glad is on track to move forward, to have what the Brits have. When you send the wire, you identify not only the number of the account you're sending it to, but also the name of the person or entity that's supposed to receive that. At that time, back in 2001, you said that payee matching is not the best way to do it. There are other ways to do it, and that you'd be happy to get back to me as to how you're going to make sure that an email from a Nigerian prince does not get the wired funds, particularly in a housing transaction, wired to an account number that turns out to be in Lagos. What progress do you have? When can home buyers have a system where they're sending it to a named payee as well as to a number?
So I hope we did come back in a timely way to you on that, but it's a problem you've brought to our attention. You're right, over many years, and we continue to focus on that.
Well, the bureaucrats who are working on this don't want to do what the Brits did. They've proven it can be done. You said you were going to accomplish the same goal in some other way, and it has been a while, and it's not solved, nor are you aware of any solution. I would hope that you would go back and say, we don't want to add this anxiety to every real estate transaction. We go back to the drawing boards, follow what the Brits have done, and have payee matching. Finally, as to crypto, cryptocurrency says what it means. Hidden money. That's what it means. And if we impose know your customer and anti-money laundering statutes to it, it won't be crypto anymore. What crypto wants is to have part of its ecosystem above the waterline, visible and subject to know your customer, and then have the rest of the iceberg below the waterline.
Gentleman's time's expired. I will now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman McHenry, thank you very much. Chairman Powell, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate not only your professionalism but your direction at us. Chairman Powell, I know that the Fed considers divergences, and you talked about it as you spoke in your opening statement about consumer price index, personal consumer expenditures, inflation, GDP, and all these things are talked about in your report, monetary report, March 3, 2023. Thank you. A couple days ago, I had an opportunity to see that an economist, Arthur Laffer, produced a report that spoke about literally this country doubling GDP. Now, I know we're putting CPI, PCE, inflation, all these things into a mix. But he said that if we made changes in health care to efficiencies, we could double the current GDP rate. My question to you that I hope you can answer is, what do you think about that? Is that something that is in this document that I have missed? And it's seemingly to a person who follows this, as Art Laffer does for 50 years, what do you think is an important way to look at efficiencies in healthcare? Thank you.
So no, that's not in our monetary policy report. I'll just say one thing, and that is we do spend something like 17 or 18 in that range % of GDP delivering healthcare. Other similarly wealthy countries spend 10%. So it's the delivery system. It's not that the benefits are incredibly rich or anything like that. It's just that the delivery system is very expensive. That's $1 trillion a year that we spend and get nothing for it. This is fiscal policy, but I'm responding to your. So I would think that he may have meant that if we had a delivery system that saved that $1 trillion that doesn't really get us anything, then that would be great for the economy, which I would agree with.
So you've spoken of supply chain disruptions because it in fact is an inhibitor or an accelerator as we gain that advantage. You just talked about some seemingly which would offer some validation to Mr. Laffer as he spoke about the huge importance of this. Is that something you should start paying attention to where policy people, not only at the Fed, but your Fed banks around the country would start looking at and start putting pressure on us to gain those efficiencies as a result of a global view?
So on supply chains generally, they have suddenly been tremendously important in inflation, as you know, for the last couple of years, and for the first time really have been something that we've had to study carefully. In terms of healthcare delivery, that is strictly a question for you and for the parts of the government that are charged with it. The Fed does not have a role to play and does not seek a role in that.
Does not see a role. And yet, as I look at this, you've got a role in projecting confidence. You've got a role in education. You've got a role in who's in the workplace. You've got a role. Interest rates, and yet my point is it's such a staggering number that impacts us. Just love to have you go back. Perhaps we from this committee need to give you some direction on that. But I think your testimony today, it recognizes the staggering impact on that. I don't think it's political. The answer may be political, but I think the actual numbers are not political. It's an inefficiency that is happening across the country, not a regional matter. And so I wanted to get your take on that, and I appreciate you being here as always. Thank you for your confidence and your hard work that you give this country. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Scott of Georgia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and welcome back, Chairman Powell. Now, Chairman Powell, listen to me very carefully here, because I think we're on the verge of making a terrible mistake. Back in 2008, if you recall, Barney Frank then and Miss Waters asked me to take a look and kind of work with you and the Fed. You were a board member in 2008. And we came to the conclusion that we needed a more equitable playing field between our large banks, like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, and our regional and smaller banks, like Truist and our community banks. And we changed that. But now I hear that the Fed and the FDIC plan to drop a new rule which seeks to apply the long-term and higher capital requirements that were created, and you and I did this back in 2008, and you remember, that were created for the Goldman Sachs and for them. And now we want to apply these rules to the regional banks. There's a big difference, and we've omitted this difference if you proceed in this manner. I think it's very misguided. It works, and you and I worked on this. You recall this. You were a board member, and we saw that we needed to have a better playing field to protect. And if you all go along with this, it could put many of our regional banks and small community banks out of business. So I want you to reverse this. First of all, tell me, am I speaking the truth? Are you all planning to all of a sudden here put these smaller and regional banks under the same heavy or financial load as your large worldwide banks? Tell me.
No, we're not planning that. We believe strongly and always have in tailoring to address the different size and risk characteristics of financial institutions, and certainly nothing like that for the regionals. They won't have anything like what the very large, most systemically important banks have in terms of overall regulation.
Yeah, because I remember clearly you and I were back, I think we were on this side then, talking about this in this same committee room. And you worked with us on that. I'm glad to hear that. Where is that coming from? I mean, it's a concern. It's just a rumor. Have there been any discussions about removing the playing field and the guardrails we have here, the differentiations in the requirements between the regional banks, community banks, and your larger global banks? So there's nothing to that?
Well, I would say this. We're required by the law now, and we're doing this. Dodd-Frank actually required us.
Yes,
suggested that we should tailor, and then the S-2155 then required it. And anything that we do will reflect appropriate tailoring.
All right, so that's off the board. We're not going to change and put the smaller and regional banks under the same financial obligation role as the large banks. We got that right from you, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, good. Now let me turn to China. I'm really worried about China, and right now people may not know it, but China is the world's largest economy in terms of purchasing power. Now, at our last meeting, I talked about this move where we didn't blow the balloon up. And this is an example of what I was pointing out.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the chair of the Science Committee, Mr. Lucas of Oklahoma, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, I'd like to follow up on the topic of capital standards. one of those things we've discussed many times together. As you know, commodity markets have seen significant volatility in the last few years. And during times of tremendous economic uncertainty, like we've seen, end users turn to the markets to hedge risk, particularly those in the agriculture and energy sectors. And I know that the Fed is early in the review process of potential changes in capital requirements. Can you, I'll ask anyway. Can you commit to ensuring that these changes will not increase the cost for banks providing those commodity derivatives to end users?
That's a really specific. Can I go look at that? I'm not actually sure that the work even addresses that. So,
fair point.
To come back to you on that.
And that particular response makes me feel better, because after all, those products are very important to my folks, and make a great deal of difference in how they're able to address their issues. So, as you discussed earlier, and as you've consistently assured, the Fed's not a climate-making policymaker. You and I have talked about this issue, again, many times in the past. However, I'm concerned that the Fed could be heading in that direction and could be laying the groundwork for climate-related stress tests that would reduce access to capital for entire sectors of the economy. This would also open up the Federal Reserve, potentially to political pressure, and force the Fed, in fact, to make policy decisions related to climate change. We've seen, for example, this administration turn to regulators to impose climate policy as an alternative to the legislative process. Chairman Powell, how careful are you in ensuring that the Fed does not place itself into the climate debate? And how can Congress ensure that the Fed's regulatory toolkit is not, shall we say, warped into creating climate policy outcomes?
So I think we do have a narrow but real role there, which is around bank supervision, making sure the banks understand and can manage their risks over time from climate. I think my colleagues and I all understand that it's a tightly circumscribed role that we're playing, and that we're not looking to move into an area where we're actually becoming a climate policymaker. I would completely agree with you, though, that over time that border needs to be very carefully guarded, and I will tell you that I will do that as long as I'm at the Board of Governors.
I very much appreciate that, because, again, it's a very important issue to the 3rd District of Oklahoma. Traditional production agriculture, oil and gas, and the actions that the Fed takes have a significant impact back home. So it's vital that we resist the demands to do that sort of thing now or in the future. And I very much appreciate that response. And with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts, the ranking member of the Digital Asset Subcommittee, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your willingness to come here and to update us. Last week, the Treasury Department announced that leaders from Treasury would begin to meet regularly with leaders from the Fed and from the White House to discuss a possible CBDC, central bank digital currency, and other payment innovations. In the statement, it was mentioned, and I'll quote from it, it said that the Fed is encouraged to provide periodic public updates as it continues its research and its technical experimentation on central bank digital currencies. I was wondering, first of all, when you might be expecting to share some of these public updates. What's the timing on that?
So we did go out for comment in general on a CBDC a year or so ago, and I do expect we'll go out. I can't give you a date, but we'll certainly go out and engage. We engage with the public on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
We're also doing research on policy and also on technology. That's what we're up to.
I'm aware of the Boston Fed has a partnership there. The Hamilton project over there with the folks from MIT Media Lab, they're doing a great job. But it says here that the discussions would include technical experimentation. I was just wondering, at what level are you talking about? Making decisions on architecture for a CBDC, a retail CBDC?
We're not at the stage of making any real decisions. What we're doing is experimenting in kind of early stage experimentation. How would this work? Does it work? What's the best technology? What's the most efficient? we're really at an early stage but we're making progress on sort of technological issues. The policy issues are equally important, though. We haven't decided that this is something that the financial system in the country want or need.
Right.
So that's going to be very important.
Right. Well, I think I speak for the chairman as well. Would love to have more dialogue with the Fed on that, and maybe bring in the folks from MIT as well, and just make sure that Congress and this committee is as up to date as others. Let me switch over to Fed now. There are some champions of digital currency and stable coins in particular that continue to cite the need for faster payment systems. However, as was earlier mentioned, the Fed now is a service that the Fed is working on to finalize that will allow for instant payments between bank accounts. And the Fed has a target release date for Fed Now between May and July, which is right around the corner. Do you see any reason why cryptocurrencies would provide faster payments than the Fed Now system? And would this offer, with the transparency of Fed Now, would it offer distinct advantages over some of these stable coins that are touting faster payments?
What Fed Now will do is it will enable all the banks, any bank in the United States, not just the big ones, to offer instantly available funds and real-time payments to their customers. That's what it will do. So that's a great thing. A CBDC, I think you're asking whether a CBDC would serve some of that, but a CBDC is going to be years in the evaluation. And, I think we can get this into the hands of the public very quickly. And I think
Not sure what happened to Chair Powell here. Just a sec.
State banks that were authorized to issue their own currency. But when the greenback came out, all of those various currencies went to zero because, trillions right now. And I'm just thinking, if we had those advantages built into a CDBC, wouldn't those alternatives go to zero if they did not have the transparency and the full faith and credit that we enjoy?
So certainly unbacked cryptocurrencies that don't have any intrinsic value but nonetheless trade for a positive number, those I've never understood the valuation of those. Stable coins are actually, many of them are really, they're drawing on the credibility of the dollar. They have dollar-based, they're dollar denominated mainly, and they have dollar-based reserves, although we don't know what's in the reserves because there's no regulation.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer, is recognized for 5 minutes. The chair of the National Security Subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Powell, for being here this morning. The reserve currency status of the dollar to the U.S. has enormous financial and national security benefits. In the wake of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the Fed took action to prevent the Kremlin from accessing more than $300 billion in reserves, roughly half of Russia's reserves. However, this led to an accelerated effort by countries like China to de-dollarize their official foreign exchange reserves. Just last week, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal titled, "Russia Turns to the Yuan in an Effort to Ditch the Dollar." Not only that, but China's President Xi Jinping pushed for the settlement of energy trades in the Chinese yuan at a summit with Arab leaders in December. The question is, are you concerned about these actions by Russia and China to establish different reserves and conduct transactions in non-U.S. dollars?
So the U.S. dollar is the widely accepted and really the only serious candidate for the world's principal reserve currency, and that's because of our democratic institutions, our liquid markets, the rule of law, and all those kinds of things, and also the fact that the dollar has held its value over time. So other countries who are competing on other playing fields want to establish different currencies, but really the dollar is the one that's going to be used more broadly in international commerce because we have those aspects and other countries don't.
Well, that's true to now, but my question is, are you concerned about the actions of these countries? Because if they see themselves being challenged or are concerned, for instance, if China would invade Taiwan, as Russia invaded Ukraine, there were some sanctions put on. And I don't disagree with the sanctions. The last time you were here, though, Mr. Chairman, I asked a question because it's an instructive moment for us from the standpoint that knowing that we put sanctions on Russia, all other different accounts, as well as the oligarchs from that country, are we thinking about doing the same thing to China when they invade Taiwan? And your answer at that point was no. We passed a bill out of this committee last week to ask the administration, basically, to start thinking about that in those terms. What kind of situations can you come up with? Are you talking to allies, begin to talk to them, to start putting together a list of how you would go about sanctioning the different individuals, the different accounts, things like that? So have you started thinking about that at all yet?
Well, let me say, the business of sanctions is entirely in the hands of the elected government and the Treasury Department. We are an implementer as it relates to banks. That's it.
Yeah, but we're going to take your advice on different aspects of this, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry?
We're going to take your advice on the different aspects of this.
Well, I mean, honestly, when the sanctions were being put in place, Treasury was doing it. We weren't doing it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it works.
Next question. There was an article, again, in one of the political newspapers yesterday, I guess it was, and it talked about the problem that we have here with the Fed's balance sheet. It says it now appears similar to a hedge fund whose long-term assets are financed by short-term borrowing, and the bottom line is that it's going to cost money. The Fed now has a negative income as a result of having to do this. And so it says here that the Fed will simply borrow the money to pay the bills. Is this true? That the Fed's losing money right now as a result of the way you've got the borrowings that you've purchased structured?
The place I would start is that the Fed has, we always turn over all of our earnings in every year. We turn them over on an ongoing basis, and we've turned over something like $1.2 trillion in earnings just in the last, decade or so. So we always know that when we raise interest rates,
okay,
you're going to lose money.
And
of course,
but you agree with the point that we have a negative income right now.
That's
and
right.
This makes my point to my next question, or my concern is, the CFPB gets their money the CFPB gets their money to run their agency from the Fed.
That's right.
So basically, there's no money for the Fed to pay the CFPB's bills if this is the case, unless you continue to borrow, which is basically what's going to happen now. Is you're going to have to borrow money to be able to pay the CFPB's bills. Is that not correct?
No, we don't borrow money. We issue, basically, yes, we don't shut down the Fed when we have negative income.
Okay.
We can pay our bills and we can pay.
So my follow-up question then is, do you do any accountability or assessing of the CFPB's spending of these dollars at all?
No, we don't.
So they just get a blank check. You just told me they just got a blank check. They send you a bill, you send them a check. There's no accountability for them.
No, I think there are limits built into the law, which I don't have in the front of my head.
I have yet to see a limit, Mr. Chairman. I'd love to see what the limits are because I don't think that they've ever agreed that they have that. But I see my time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to Mr. Foster, the ranking member of the Financial Institutions Monetary Policy Subcommittee.
Thank you. And just a quick comment. I think it's a mistake to imagine that you can completely hide from the macroeconomic effects of technology in your scenario planning. We just talked briefly about healthcare costs. Obesity, half of our healthcare costs, and there are treatments in these GLP-1 receptor agonists that look like they're just a home run against obesity. And so these will be near-term impacts which will have macroeconomic effects. So just a comment. I hope you have a certain fraction of futurists in the room when you're talking about your scenario planning, because a lot of that future is like now. Okay, back to economics. So we have this historically low unemployment rate, 3.4%. And historically, this would be considered to drive runaway inflation. Your predecessor, Alan Greenspan, repeatedly referred to dangerously low levels of unemployment. And yet we see inflation is coming down. So what is going on here? How can we have these historically low levels of unemployment without having inflation take off? Is it possible that we simply have less frictional unemployment in our system, due perhaps to the fact that people get their new jobs online and have a job lined up before they quit?
So inflation is coming down, but it's very high is the thing. And some part, I've never said all of it or most of it, but some part of the high inflation that we're experiencing is very likely related to an extremely tight labor market. Wages affect prices and prices affect wages, so I do think that's part of it. More to your point, though, there was a time when there was a tight relationship between inflation and unemployment. In other words, the Phillips curve was steep, and that went away over the period of the Great Moderation. And really, in our thinking, that's because people came to expect 2% inflation, and we had 2% inflation, and then people just stopped focusing on inflation, and it stayed very low. So there was really no relationship, or very, very tiny relationship. We could have very weak economic growth or very strong economic growth, and we wouldn't have inflation respond very much. That was before the pandemic, though.
Okay. Well, I hope you don't overlearn, some of the lessons there. It's one of my worries that there have been a number of exogenous shocks to the system here, and it'll take a while to go through them. And if you want to be careful there. Now, in a related issue, when you say refer to the totality of factors, you're looking at a mixture of leading and lagging indicators when you look in this totality of factors. And my question, perhaps you might be paying too much attention to the lagging indicators and not enough to the leading indicators. The example that's referenced in your remarks and is in more detail in the report about the difference between using current rental payments versus the amount that you pay for a new rental contract, and difference in how much they lag. Had you paid more attention, for example, to the leading indicators like current rental contracts, then you probably would have picked up inflation earlier. You would have been, not gotten so far behind the curve on that. And secondly, there are policy implications going forward. If you look at current rental prices for new contracts, we're much farther along in fixing inflation, and that you can take your foot off the brake. And so what's your thinking on that, and whether you may perhaps be systematically not paying enough attention to leading indicators versus lagging ones?
So we've had our eyes on the whole housing inflation thing from the very beginning, and right now what I would say is that every forecaster is baking in lower rent increases. That's a big part of why people think inflation is going to come down in 2023. I think the thing with transitory was more had to do with goods. And it had to do with the thought that these supply-side disruptions would go away much quicker than they would, that the labor market disruptions would go away much quicker than they did. And in hindsight, it just took much longer for those disturbances to go away.
Yeah. So with hindsight, and if you allow yourself to Monday morning quarterback yourself, you probably would have gone up to 4% earlier and not had such a big problem with inflation. And so what is your... are there structural things you can contemplate, or even after action reviews, to say what would have happened if we would have paid more attention to the leading indicators, or improve the in engineering term, improve the bandwidth of your feedback regulator? This is something, if you want to get the best result, you need a high bandwidth feedback in the system, even when there's averaging on the back end.
So this is something we only think about during waking and sleeping hours, as you can imagine. It's really hard to know what the lessons are. Again, we really thought things would. Nobody had seen the supply chains collapse. No one had seen labor force participation plummet. We didn't know, or unemployment go to 14% and higher than that. Really, we didn't know how long it would take to go away. And if we ever see this pitch again, we'll know how to swing at it. But it's been
we'll now recognize
pretty bunch of firsts. Sorry.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman, his time has expired. We'll now go to the gentlewoman from Missouri, the chair of the Capital Markets Subcommittee, Ms. Wagner, for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Chairman McHenry. And Chair Powell, welcome. Thank you for your service and for being here today. Yesterday, I was pleased to hear you discuss how inflation is severely hurting the working people in America. In your testimony, you also state that strong wage growth is good for workers, but only if it is not eroded by inflation. And that is key. Inflation is a tax, a hidden tax on every American. If the Federal Reserve were to shirk its mandates to stabilize prices, leaving inflation alarmingly high, what would it cost America's hard-working families in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District and beyond?
So I think the costs of failure to restore price stability would be extremely high, and while there will be costs to success, the costs of failure will be much higher. You'd be looking at an extended period where people learn to expect and live with high and volatile inflation, and it's very, very hard to have rising real incomes during such a period. So it'd be a bad thing for the country.
Can you reassure the committee that the Fed remains committed to bringing prices down for our constituents?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I hereby assure you.
And changing topics here a bit, as China's economy reopens and about 18% of the world's population resumes its consumption of oil and other key goods, what sort of inflationary impact will we see here in the United States, sir?
So a faster reopening of China, which it looks like we may be seeing, it does have the potential to put upward pressure on commodity prices, but it also would mean a faster sort of unraveling of the problems in supply chain. So those would be offsetting effects. I think sitting here today, we don't expect the net effect to be big. For the United States, it might be bigger for other parts of the world, but we think it ought to be moderate overall.
Well, China is one of the world's top oil importers. And do you expect any inflationary effects on global energy markets as China's oil consumption returns to their previous levels?
So I think oil prices could be affected, and I think that's a big concern in Europe, for example. We have our own domestic oil, and we've got a lot of natural gas as well.
We sure do. I wish we were actually harvesting more of that liquid natural gas. Chair Powell, you, Vice Chair Barr, and many others have recently identified that the banking system is well capitalized and strong. Bank capitalization remained robust during the shock of the pandemic and related shutdowns of economic activity. Capitalization of large financial institutions weathered severe stress testing mandated by the Fed. And despite all of that, as also previously mentioned by Chairman McHenry, Vice Chair Barr insists on conducting a review of capital rules. I'm concerned that this review is being conducted in a silo and that the findings will not be made fully available to the public. Taking such an approach in the context of this holistic capital requirement review would make it impossible to conduct a transparent rulemaking process, denying the public information necessary to consider and to comment. I think this is just simply not appropriate in this situation, and I'm concerned by the lack of clarity, I think is the best word, perhaps at this point, by the Vice Chair. A couple questions. You've served on the Fed board for over 10 years since the financial crisis regulatory framework has been put in place. And over that period, have you seen any real-world evidence that America's banks are undercapitalized?
So American banks are strongly capitalized, and I believe Vice Chair Barr has said that as well. But
yes.
The point is there haven't been any real proposals to evaluate yet, and when there are, that will be done in a highly transparent manner.
I hope so. I'm glad to hear you say in a highly transparent manner. Do you agree that excessively high capital levels constrain banks' lending capacity with spillover effects on jobs and living standards for Americans?
So I think it's always a balance, right? More capital means more safety and soundness and more ability to withstand terribly stressful periods. But it also, it's more expensive. Equity capital is more expensive. U.S. banks have competed incredibly well around the world.
Yes,
with
they have.
high levels of
Internationally.
capital. But so that's a trade-off that you you're always going to be making when you think about capital.
Gentlewoman's
My time is expired. Yes, thank you.
We'll now
Ranking
recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio, the ranking member of the National Security Subcommittee, Ms. Beatty. Ms. Beatty, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I like that title. To Chairman Powell, thank you for coming and being such a good colleague and friend. I have a couple questions I'm going to try to get through quickly. Chair Powell, in a press conference last month, you stated, quote, "There is a lot of spending coming into the construction pipeline, both private and public, and so that's going to support economic activity," end of quote. How do you think the strong pipeline of funding from what the Democrats put together in passing the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, and the CHIPS Science Act will do to have economic activity this year and moving forward?
So I guess I was making the point that there are a lot of sources of demand that we can rely on, even though demand has been relatively increasing at a relatively modest rate. Part of it is...
Will this help in that demand?
Yes. I mean, there is state and local governments I mentioned are about...
So would you say this is a great thing that we've done coming from the left over here?
Not for me to judge the merits of what gets done, but I'm just saying there's
But
demand,
it will contribute.
there that will support economic
And support
activity.
it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to assume from that that's a positive. Let me go to the second question. Chairman Powell, the Federal Open Markets Committee is projecting that unemployment will increase to 4.6% by the end of the year. And those costs, as we know, won't be borne equally. If we look at the ratio from the last time unemployment was 4.6% and compare it to our numbers now, it would mean that white unemployment would go up to about 0.9, but black unemployment would go up by 2.3%. Does that sound somewhat accurate to you?
Yes.
Can you address the disparity impact with that? And before you answer, let me go to the book and thank you that was put at our places together. You made in this book with your signature on, it is stated, however, while disparities in unemployment have largely returned to pre-pandemic levels, there still remains significant disparities in absolute levels of employment across groups like African Americans and Hispanics. So can you address that?
I can. So right now, to your point, actually, African American unemployment is, I think, 5.4%, which is just about as low as it's been since we started tracking it in 1972.
But differential from majority by...
I'm going to say, so that's 5.4, whereas the overall is 3.4, and that includes blacks, so that means for whites is well lower than that. What happens is, so there's a persistent gap between black and white unemployment, and also when unemployment goes up quickly in a recession, it goes up much faster for African Americans. When the economy grows again, it comes down faster. So that's somehow embedded in our economy. We don't really have the best thing we can do is achieve stable prices so that we can have long expansions. And what happens in those long expansions is that the labor market gets tight, sustainably tight, and we have historic lows in unemployment, including for African Americans.
Let me say thank you, and let me also, again, thank you. As you know, in the 117th, I was the chair of the D&I committee, and let the record state that you always pushed for making sure that you understood and respected that. And in that, this is very minor and certainly personal to me. In this report, maybe those who helped you author it, I would like to see the areas that talks about unemployment not under a title of special topics, but something that draws a little more attention to it as some of the others, just very minor. Last question I have. Can you tell me if the Feds is committed to working with the other agencies like the FDIC and the OCC to finalize a rule soon on CRA? Certainly that's something of great interest to many of my colleagues. So can you give us any updates on it or how the process is going or what we can expect?
Yes. So with Governor Brainerd's departure for the White House, I've asked Vice Chair Barr to take the lead in moving it forward. There's would characterize it that there's essentially agreement between the three banking agencies on the changes to be made. That's all being written up and vetted, and at a certain point, members of the Board of Governors will be briefed on it. We'll vote on it.
Is there anything we can do to help with that?
No, I think we're hard at work on it, and it's going to take some months, but I think we're nearing we can see the airport, and we'll be landing in a few
Gentlewoman's
months.
time has expired. The
Thank you.
gentleman from Kentucky, the Chair of the Financial Institutions and Monetary Policy Subcommittee, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman McHenry and Chairman Powell. Economic data are mixed, as you know. On the one hand, low unemployment, robust hiring, strong consumer spending, and persistent core inflation, and a CPI that's still more than 3 times your 2% target suggests more aggressive tightening is warranted. On the other hand, because the Fed misjudged the inflationary impact of Democrats' overspending, kept interest rates too low for far too long, and failed to end quantitative easing soon enough, the Fed has been forced to raise the Fed funds rate 450 basis points in just 11 months and reduce the M2 money supply at the fastest rate since the 1930s. As a result, wage gains have slowed, credit card debt is at an all-time high, the housing market is in a slump, and the yield curve is inverted. I agree with you that the historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. But what would you say to those who caution about the lag effects of monetary policy, the precipitous decline in liquidity? Will the economy have to suffer a recession in order to bring inflation down to 2%?
We are very well aware of the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. Those are long and variable, and I would stress highly uncertain. There is really no agreement on exactly how long they are, but we know that slowing down the pace of rate hikes this year is a way for us to see more of those effects as they come in.
In December, most Fed officials expected to lift rates this year to between 5 and 5.5%. Is that still your estimated terminal rate, or does the data suggest that the terminal rate could be higher than 5.5%?
My colleagues and I will write down new forecasts and release them to the public on March 22. But as I mentioned in my testimony, the data we've seen so far this year suggests that the ultimate level of rates will need to be higher. But we still have some more data to come in between now and the meeting. But as of today, it suggests a higher level than that.
Let's go to Vice Chairman Barr's review of the capital framework. A lot of questions for you on that. When Governors Brainerd, Quarles, Clarida, Bowman, and Waller made up the board under your leadership, major changes in policy were addressed following board consensus and not when there was significant dissent. Will you commit to not implementing a new capital framework following this holistic review or the Basel Endgame if there is considerable dissent from the board?
I can't really commit to that. We are a consensus kind of an organization, and that's what we'll work toward. But ultimately,
Would that be a break from your prior practices? You're a consensus builder, Mr. Chairman. You pride yourself in that, and we credit you for being a consensus-oriented chairman. Will you commit to continuing that practice and not allow major changes to the bank capital regulatory framework to be made by one person?
Well, they can't be made by any one person, but I do commit to that, and I commit to doing everything I possibly can to bring people together in consensus, to have something that can be broadly supported.
Thank you. Earlier this year, you said, and I quote, "We are not and will not be a climate policy maker." However, in the Fed's draft principles on climate-related financial risks, one proposed principle suggested that boards of directors or of a financial institution should consider making changes to its compensation policies to align with values in the context of supposed climate risks. It appears then that the Federal Reserve, through regulation, wants to begin implementing climate policies. So which is it? There seems to be a disconnect between your statements publicly and the rules that the board is putting forward for comment.
Well, I feel strongly that climate change is an important issue that needs to be addressed by elected people. It's just not something that we've been charged with by Congress, clearly. So we do have a narrow role, and that role will be around making sure that banks understand and can manage the risks that they're running, and that's going to be it. And I, as I said before, we don't want to drift into becoming a climate policymaker, and we'll have to guard that border very carefully.
Regarding the Fed's climate scenario analysis pilot program, did the board vote to approve the creation of that pilot program?
I have to check, but I don't think so. I think it was already authorized.
And this is a concern that I have. I'm concerned that one governor acting unilaterally to implement major policy changes without board consensus is a problem. And so I would urge you and your colleagues on the board to continue a consensus-oriented approach, and I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, Mr. Himes of Connecticut, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Chairman Powell. Thank you for your careful conduct of monetary policy, independent of the many political desires that circulate in this building. Independent monetary policy is a bedrock of a solid economy. I want to reflect for a moment on another bedrock of the American economy, the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is now being put at risk by the Republican majority. My Republican friends know how very dangerous a game they are playing. They know that salary payments to our soldiers are at risk. They know that their irresponsibility will raise mortgage rates for new home buyers. But they say this is the only time we focus on spending in the debt, which of course is baloney. It's a pernicious form of baloney. The time to focus on the deficit is when you are voting for the spending and the tax cuts that create the deficit. When you're voting for the Trump tax cuts, which the CBO said would add $2 trillion to the national debt, that's the moment to consider whether you want to do that. Not when the good name of the United States is hanging in the balance. This stuff gets a little complicated, but the American people really need to understand what's happening here. The Congress sits down to a huge 10-course meal of tax cuts and spending and more defense spending and expansion of this program and stimulus, all of which we vote for collectively. First course, second course, white wine, red wine, 4 servings of dessert. And then the bill comes and my Republicans say, whoa, wait a minute, hold on, look at this bill. This is irresponsible. Do we really want to pay this bill? That's not the moment for the consideration. The moment is when you're ordering 4 helpings of dessert. That's when we should be talking about it and taking responsibility for the choices that we make without putting the full faith and credit of the United States at risk. Now here's where the hypocrisy comes in. My Republican friends like to point the finger at this side of the aisle and blame us. But, Chairman, as you know, fully 1/4, 25% of today's United States debt was accrued in the 4 years of the Trump administration. This country's been around for 246 years, and fully 1/4 of the United States debt was accrued under President Trump. By the way, speaking of hypocrisy, in the 4 years of President Trump, the debt ceiling was raised or suspended 3 times. I didn't even notice. But now, of course, we have a different president, and so the calculus is different. Now, Mr. Chairman, I don't think I'm going to persuade the majority to act responsibly here. I actually think the markets will persuade them. And you'll recall, because we were watching this closely, September 29th, 2008, the Republican House of Representatives voted down the Great Recession Rescue Package. As the vote was going down in the House of Representatives, the equity market dropped 7%. $1.2 trillion lost in people's retirement accounts. Now, Congress sobered up, and a couple days later, we passed the Rescue Act. So, Mr. Chairman, there is a question here, and the question is this. You and I both watch the markets pretty closely. Treasury tells us that on June 5th, that's just 3 months away, on June 5th, the Treasury runs out of money. So my question to you, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm asking you to be a little speculative here, but what should we watch for? What market signals could indicate that the markets are getting fed up with the manifest irresponsibility around this? Give us some things that we should be looking for.
And I'd love to, but I'm going to limit myself to what other Fed chairs have said about the debt ceiling, which is that it does need to be raised by Congress. In the end, there are no rabbits in hats, as I mentioned, and also that no one should assume that we, the Fed, this is the Fed's business, is to protect the economy from various events. And I wouldn't assume, no one should assume, that we have the tools to protect the highly uncertain effects of that kind of an event.
So monetary policy is obviously very concerned with interest rates. If global capital markets begin to decide that we're really serious about hurting ourselves this time, is it possible that we could see interest rates rise more because borrowers of United States debt decide that we're actually a little risky? Is that possible?
I think that and many other things are possible. The thing is, we've never crossed that line, and if we cross that line, we're going to find out, and I think it's highly uncertain.
Okay, so that's possible, and I don't like pressing you on these things, but you said this and many other things are possible. You want to elaborate on what might be in the category of many other things?
Rather not, actually.
Okay, I figured. All right, thank you, Mr. Powell. Again, I really thank you for your really responsible conduct of monetary policy, and there's a reason that you are insulated from our political desires, and I very much appreciate that, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We'll now recognize the chair of the Small Business Committee, Mr. Roger Williams of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman, it's good to see you. Always good to have you here. In past congressional testimonies, you've repeatedly stated that you support protecting the state-based system of insurance regulation, which is the most effective and competitive in the world. In my home state of Texas is the world's 7th largest insurance market, proving the success of this system. Now at the International Association for Insurance Supervisors Conference in November, there is the opportunity to have the U.S. state-based aggregation method become formally recognized as comparable or equivalent to the insurance capital standard. We should not be following the European model that has increased regulations and less competition, and we should prioritize a model that encourages deregulation, competition, and less government involvement in pricing. So my question is, Chairman, can you highlight the benefits of the U.S. state-based aggregation method compared to the European model regarding market resiliency and systematic risk? And can you confirm that you will push for aggregation method to be deemed equivalent by the IAIS?
I can say this. I do think that our insurance regulatory system has proved itself appropriate and adequate and gotten the job done for a long time, and we don't need to be copying other countries or other regions' insurance regulatory system. I'm a little rusty on the details of the capital requirements, but that sounds right.
But our bottom line is our side works, the other doesn't. We need to stay where we are.
Our side works.
Yeah, thank you. Also, in the past, you stated that banks were well capitalized. We've talked about that today, but now there have been increased conversations about raising capital requirements. Numerous economic studies have found that raising capital requirements for banks will increase borrowing costs for their consumer and commercial customers. And I'm somebody that's owned 50 years. I've never had a day I wasn't out of debt, so I'm concerned about this. And implementing additional regulatory capital requirements will slow economic growth and limit financial institutions' lending ability. So do you believe that raising capital requirements would raise the cost of borrowing and add cost to our economy in Main Street America?
Well, it depends on which banks experience higher capital requirements, and there isn't any proposal to evaluate right now, of course, but it's always a trade-off. You know, higher capital is good in a sense because it keeps banks able to lend during bad times. That's really a good thing. Too much capital, though, probably limits credit availability, so we're trying to strike that balance always.
And this has been touched on a little today, but let me come from a different angle on it. But the Reserve was created to act as a nonpartisan entity that remains separate from party politics. We talked about that. And unfortunately, throughout recent years, the Fed has gotten caught up in politically charged issues like economic inequality, gender and race discrimination, and climate change. Recently, the Federal Reserve Board proposed guidance on managing climate-related risks for large banks, further proving that the Fed is giving in to some political pressure and operating outside its intended purpose and responsibilities. So our country's financial leaders, in my mind, should be focusing on addressing runaway inflation instead of worrying about the financial institutions are doing to monitor climate change. So, and we touched on this a little bit, but how can the Fed ensure that they're not placing undue regulations and guidance on banks by forcing involvement in partisan green politics? And how's the Federal Reserve ensuring they remain separate from political influence?
So I think it's absolutely critical that we do. I mean, our independence is partly founded on the idea that we will stay out of stuff that you have not assigned us to do. And if we're going to wander all over and take on the hot issue of the day, our case for our independence is dramatically weakened. On climate change, I think we do. You mentioned the guidance, and then there are also the stress scenarios, and those are the two things that we've done. We tried to keep those tightly focused on the banks understanding and being able to manage the risks that they'll run over the longer time periods on climate, and not slide into a broader sort of policy-making role on climate change. And I accept that could be a slippery slope and a moving border. And I just want to say, and I think my colleagues feel the same way on the board, that we're going to guard that border carefully, and we're going to stick to our role and not try to be policymakers the way in many other countries the central bank is out there in the lead with the support of the public doing climate policy. But that's not where we are in the United States, and we're not going to pretend that it is.
I've got some time left. I'll yield back, but I just want to say, as an auto dealer, I'm looking for the first day of that rate cut. So, thank you for being here. We appreciate it.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for holding this hearing. Chairman Powell, a pleasure to see you again. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's always great to see you, because I always think of the old Republicans, the ones who are very noble, did the right thing, didn't play chicken with the economy, very forthright. And so anyway, I appreciate you being here very much. Like some of my colleagues on the other side, I'd say the same thing about some of them, and I appreciate you. So we heard today that the inflation is Biden's fault. So what is the inflation rate in the European Union today?
It's high.
It's high. Is it 10% possibly?
I think if you're talking about headline, I don't have this figure in my head, but it's very, very high from a headline standpoint. Yeah. And they've had core inflation move up too.
Yeah. So are they following Biden's then policies? Is that what caused the inflation? Because it seems to be Biden's fault.
So I think inflation is everywhere, and it must have to do with a common factor, and that common factor has to be the reopening of the economy after, and the things that were done on COVID. On the other hand, each country has a little bit different case, and I think you have to be careful. We had much more of a demand-oriented issue than they did. Now they have their inflation looks a lot like ours did a year ago.
Right. Yeah, I just had to bring it up because, again, Mr. Sherman brought it up, but it's interesting every time I hear inflation is caused by Biden, I wonder why is it all over the world? I mean, it's not because of the pandemic, of course, or Europe's at war. I mean, that wouldn't cause it, of course. It'd have to be Biden's policies. That's ridiculous. And I think the voters saw through it last time. So I haven't been here 15 years as my good friend, Mr. Foster. I've only been here 11. But when I first got here, the boogeyman, and I heard it all from my friends on the other side, was Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank was going to be the end of banking. And in fact, some of my colleagues would almost scream how horrible this was. And then we got the bankers up here during a real stress test, which was the pandemic. And we asked them, has it been helpful to have Dodd-Frank? Do you know what they said? Do you know what they said?
I don't.
Oh, they said it was helpful. In fact, it kept the banks capitalized. It was fascinating. Now, to be fair to them, they did complain about some of the smaller issues, but not Dodd-Frank in general, the bill. Then it seemed that CFPB, that became the next boogeyman. But they're starting to seem to fade on that, and I think the reason for that is the CFPB has actually helped so many people that now a lot of their own constituents now are getting helped by the CFPB, so all of a sudden there's not quite the energy. So now they're attacking ESG. And they're saying that you and everybody else is somehow conspiring to make sure they don't buy their oil or their coal. Are you conspiring to do that? Are you conspiring?
I don't believe we're conspiring.
No. Now, I heard it was supposed climate risk. Is there risk in the climate change?
Yes.
There is? Could it affect the bank?
Certainly, in the longer run, yes.
Yeah, of course it can. Do you think insurance companies take this into account?
Yes, actually, I believe they do.
They absolutely do.
Who write long duration liabilities, they certainly do.
Of course they do. I mean, they're very concerned with it. Weather is a big deal. I was a vice president of Liberty Mutual in their corporate legal department, and I can tell you weather and the changing of the weather, we used to have what we call catastrophes. And these catastrophes happen every 25, 50, 100 years. Now those 25, 50, and 100-year events happen every 5 years, every 2 years. So of course it is. I mean, it's ridiculous not to take a look at these ESG factors. We have to. And again, I'm glad that you guys are taking a look at it because it's real. I'm glad that, the president's taking a look at it. And it's sad that my colleagues on the other side just want to stick their head in the sand and say, no, climate change is supposed climate change. No, the reality is it's real climate change, and it's costing billions and billions of dollars. And if you don't believe it, go ask all those poor people in Florida that had those huge hurricanes come through and wipe them out. So again, I appreciate very much the work that you've done. The only thing I hope is, as you said, if we ever see this pitch again, we'll know how to swing at it. And I hope we don't get the pitch of defaulting, because I'm not sure we'll know how to swing at that one. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time. Gentleman yields back. Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now go to the chair of the Oversight Subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Huizinga, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to move quickly, and good to see you again, Chair. I caught a little bit of the Senate hearings yesterday, and you had a lot of pressure to keep the sugar high going. And frankly, if the Fed and many of our colleagues had listened to what many of us were saying, we should have been weaned off that artificially low, cheap money that kept the party going, and frankly, we wouldn't be in this position. To reference Chair Greenspan's punch bowl analogy, not only did no one have the courage to remove the punch bowl, you had people cheering on the pouring of another bottle of 151 rum into the punch bowl. And here you got folks wanting to do the exact same thing. Let's spend more. And now here we are. You have an impossible decision to slow the economy or let everyone get crushed by inflation. And we know tightening means a slower economy. Slower economy means fewer jobs. Fewer jobs hit those who can least afford to lose a job. And so in short, the lower rungs of the economic ladder will suffer more than the rest of the ladder. So that's the state of play of where we're at. I have to hit a couple of quick issues here. I wanted to start off by discussing climate, especially given the Fed's announcement in January that it was going to conduct a pilot climate scenario analysis exercise. The Fed, along with the OCC and FDIC, have each issued proposed climate risk management principles for banks that you are attempting to finalize those by the end of the year, and the requirements don't stop at the border. The UK and the EU central banks are moving to require significant ESG disclosure regimes as well. I know the Fed is taking a look at commodities capital charges in the holistic review, but even though the Fed isn't forcing banks to encompass climate analysis in their stress tests, there are many initiatives at the Fed that are going to make it more costly for banks to finance traditional fossil fuel companies. So I want to ask you a very specific question. Will you commit that you will withhold support for a new capital rule that increases capital charges on bank activities in traditional energy companies?
I can't sit here and promise what I will and will not vote for, because I don't know what's going to be in the proposal. But that's not the kind of thing I think we're looking at.
I'm sorry, it's not the kind of thing.
So this isn't about this is about overall capital levels more than anything else, I think, rather than the specific thing you're talking about.
Okay. We're going to follow up on that because we need to have a real-time conversation about what that is going on there. I want to quickly switch topics and go in a different direction for this next question. I want to ask you about two opinions issued by your legal staff in November of 2019 and December of 2020 to the asset managers Vanguard and BlackRock. Mr. Chairman McHenry, I'd like to submit the two letters for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. These opinions appear to outline the parameters of both how both Vanguard and BlackRock can operate without being deemed a bank holding company. In addition to the legal restrictions outlined by the bank holding company, these opinions listed out here in quite detail list out commitments that the companies would need to take to avoid being viewed as having, quote, control. These opinions also appear to provide assurances that the Federal Reserve Board staff would not recommend that the board find the asset managers to be bank holding companies. Further, it is unclear whether the board will take any steps beyond a periodic self-certification by the asset managers to monitor compliance with the condition that they, quote, not take any action to control a banking organization. As some asset managers play a larger role and clearly strive to influence policy, in companies across the free market, we need to remain vigilant. So, Chair Powell, is the board taking any steps to assess or monitor whether Vanguard and BlackRock are complying with the commitments made in November of 2019 and December of 2020, respectively?
I would have to check and get back to you on that.
Okay.
Familiar with the issue.
I appreciate that, but that says to me that doesn't sound like there's an assessment that's taking place ongoing or scrutiny of that. Is somebody reviewing that, or is someone in charge of reviewing that?
Honestly, that's a very specific, narrow question. I'm quite familiar with the issue.
Well, it's specific and narrow to two companies, but not to an industry. I mean, that's what we need to be driving at. And I guess we need to find out whether there's somebody proactively reviewing these activities and these commitments that the companies have made as well as the Fed has made. So how often do you think they should be reassessed? Annually, monthly, biannually?
This is a very narrow set of questions. I can get you great answers really easily, but I don't have them in my head.
I look forward to those great answers, and I yield.
We'll now go to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Powell for joining us today. Chairman Powell, when you testified before the committee last June, PCE inflation was up 6.3% year over year. Just a few weeks ago, PCE data showed that the numbers decreased to 5.4%. We're moving in the right direction, but despite the Federal Reserve raising interest rates at the highest rate since October 2007, we're still far off from the 2% inflation that the Federal Reserve is targeting. Do you believe 2% is still the right target for inflation? And given the ongoing energy transition, the push to shift supply chains out of China, and the labor shortage here in the U.S., should the Fed consider adjusting its target to avoid overly burdening Americans? Would a decline to 3% inflation be enough to offer price stability without excessive economic pain?
No, 2% inflation is going to remain our longer-term inflation goal.
Are you concerned given all the other factors that I mentioned, or do you think we just have to keep sticking with that?
I think that's got to remain our longer-term inflation goal. It's the global standard, and it's our standard, and this is not a time at which we can start talking about changing it. We have no instinct to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The gig economy has grown significantly in recent years as more Americans are working as contractors or running small businesses. The Dallas Federal Reserve has written that gig workers are often not included in payrolls and not counted among the unemployed, and this may understate the number of Americans who could be counted as unemployed. The Fed has also noted the large number of Americans who are missing from the workforce after the pandemic. Do we need to change the way we think about measuring unemployment to account for these changes?
I missed the word you're saying.
Sorry, do you think we need to change the way we think about measuring unemployment to account for these changes?
I didn't catch this. You said, what was
gig.
the word?
Oh, sorry, gig. Gig workers.
Yes,
I'm sorry. Gig workers.
That's the word I didn't hear. Okay. No, we clearly
See, this is actually really bullish because they're talking about manipulating their data now, similarly to how they did with the definition of a recession. So if they manipulate the data so that the unemployment looks higher by including the quote-unquote gig economy and whatever else that they want to throw in there to make those numbers inflate, they can make this stuff look like whatever they want. So all this stuff is really just a dog and pony show. It's all manipulation of the economy. And that's really why I prefer to follow charts as opposed to listening to these morons.
We're very well aware of it, and they're supposed to be included.
It'd be great. I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Great.
Thank you. As you're also aware, many of us are having discussions about the long-term fiscal health of our country and our economy. Like many, I worry that higher interest rates will put upward pressure on the national debt. CBO already estimates that annual interest costs will nearly triple for the U.S. over the next decade. You said to the Senate yesterday that interest payments are not a consideration of the Fed, but are you concerned that higher interest rates will more rapidly make payments on the debt unsustainable? And are there actions Congress should consider to address this issue?
So I'll say what my predecessors have said, which is that we're on an unsustainable path, and we really need to. Ultimately, we will get back on a sustainable path, and the sooner we get to work on that, the less painful it will be.
And rates, of course, were low between the financial crisis and the end of 2021, particularly low. After the target inflation rates hit, what do you think the new normal looks like in terms of rates and the Fed balance sheet over the next 5 to 10 years?
It's a really good question. There was a secular decline in longer-term interest rates, which we don't control, for 40 years to the point where they were, where the 10-year was at 10-year Treasury was at 10%, and then at the end of 40 years it was quite low. You're at higher levels. You're at, as you pointed out, levels we haven't seen since earlier in this century. I don't think anybody knows what this is going to look like 5 years down the road. So you have to ask, demographics haven't gotten better. Globalization may actually move a little bit in reverse, which would tend to produce higher inflation and thus higher rates. But you have to ask the factors that caused low rates, how much of that has changed. And some of it has, but much of it hasn't.
Building on that a little bit, what's the right metric, you think, for, if you're in our shoes, for assessing our fiscal health? Do you think we should be focused on maintaining a specific debt to GDP ratio, or is there a specific number? Are there other measures lawmakers should be focusing on?
So we've traditionally focused on debt to GDP, but many people pointed out before the pandemic that rates were secularly lower and that therefore you could look at sort of real debt service. There was a lot of research on that. And by those measures, actually, debt service was much more easy to handle. Now we have the 10 years back close to 4%. And I think, we need to be careful not to assume that these secularly low longer-term rates are going to continue indefinitely, because that doesn't look likely now. And frankly, most forecasts have always shown things like the 10-year going back to a higher level, so it won't be that big of a change. I think it's more or less been handled, for example, by CBO that way.
Excellent. Thank you so much, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thanks. Now I'll go to the gentleman, the Vice Chair of the Digital Assets Subcommittee and the Chair of the Housing Subcommittee, Mr. Davidson of Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you. It's an honor to be able to talk with you today, and appreciate the work you and the monetary policy-focused portion of the Fed does. We're rooting for maybe a more consistent input from our bank regulators. So for the regulatory side, I've spoken with multiple bankers who tell me that they've never seen a higher degree of regulatory burden, steering, guidance, shaping activities in the market from regulators. And I don't think that's just narrowly focused on the Fed, but I'd ask you to look into it. There are a lot of people that feel like there's not Operation Choke Point 2.0 going on, and it's particularly focused on debanking people that are disfavored by the current executive branch primarily, just like the previous Operation Choke Point was. And so to the extent that you yield any influence over the regulatory component of the Federal Reserve, I think that would be meaningful and important, because our monetary system, part of the strength of the U.S. dollar is, of course, a stable store of value. Currencies around the world are wrestling with that and inflation, and you guys are working to tackle it. But the other part is it's an efficient means of an exchange. And when people really feel like some third party is going to steer or shape their money, they don't trust it. I mean, the unbanked and the underbanked, fundamentally, that's lack of trust is part of why they don't use our banking system today. In fact, that's part of the appeal of the digital asset space, is the permissionless nature of it. It seems that a lot of people in the financial services space that have grown up in it, that are leading it today, feel threatened by the prospect of change. And if they've maybe reluctantly concluded that you can't ban crypto, they at least want to keep it account-based so that some third party can actually control the assets, which is a polite way of saying we don't actually trust our citizens to control their money or their assets. We'll let somebody else do it for them because we can control those third parties. And in fact, that's what the regulators do, isn't it?
Isn't what?
They control the third parties. I mean, if you don't comply with the regulatory regime, you don't get to operate a financial services business, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And so at the end of the day, I think a lot of people were concerned by your remarks yesterday. I know I was, by saying that permissionless digital assets pose a systemic risk to the financial system.
Well, what we said in our guidance, I think if you read through the digital guidance, which I did getting ready for this hearing, of course I read it before we put it out the first time, but it's pretty careful to say that we don't want regulation to oppose innovation and thus entrench incumbents and things like that. It's pretty balanced, the language, and I think it essentially goes to the question of protecting the safety and soundness of institutions. And there is one, I think what we say about, I'll paraphrase it, what we say about permissionless blockchains is that they have been vehicles for fraud.
0.24%. So if you follow the your own report on fraud, it's a fraction of what it is with the U.S. dollar. So speaking of the dollar, is there any real current threat to the dollar's preeminence as the world's reserve currency?
You say you're asking a question? I didn't.
Yes, sir.
Is there a real threat?
Is there a threat?
I think that our status as the world's reserve currency is not under particularly strong threat right now. I think it's a pretty stable equilibrium. It's not a permanent equilibrium, but there isn't really a serious competitor, and that's not because of any of this. It's because of our democratic institutions and the rule of law, and the fact that the dollar's value is pretty stable.
Okay. So quickly on the repo market, just any insight into that, and then I'll have my last comment here and just leave the last word to you. But particularly curious about the repo market. But I'll close by simply saying I'd ask you to turn off the purchase of mortgage-backed securities. As the chairman of Housing and Insurance, I'm particularly concerned about affordable housing, and the artificial prop for the mortgage-backed securities does raise the cost of capital in that space. So whether you own it or occupy it or rent it, it's going to raise the cost there. But I'd just ask if you'd comment on the safety and soundness of the repo market, if you would.
Of the repo market. As far as I know, the repo market is functioning reasonably well these days. Are you talking about the reverse repo facility? Or
yes.
The reverse repo facility is a different thing. We can continue this.
I'd like to follow up with you later, and my time has expired. I yield.
Thanks.
Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Always a pleasure to see you, and appreciate your time here today. I want to start with this chart in your monetary policy report, which I think is fascinating. Chart 14 on page 17. This is this history of wage growth and job growth. And for those of you who don't have it in front of you, broadly speaking, from 2000 to 2017, we had more workers than jobs. From 17 until the COVID crisis, it was about the same. And since COVID, we've had more jobs than workers. And there's tons of rich stuff in here that I just enjoyed reading. But broadly speaking, if that was the only thing going on in the economy, I would assume that we had 20 years where it was essentially a buyer's market for labor, and the last year and a half where it's been a seller's market for labor. As you look at that, and if I go through and I look at from 2010 to 2020, CPI was up 20% over the period, and real median wages less than 10%. So for half of the economy, they didn't keep up with wages, even though we think of that as a very low inflationary period. Corporate profits were also up strongly, as you would expect. I'm not saying that with judgment, right? If it's a buyer's market for labor, you would expect the gains from labor productivity to flow to consumers and profits, and that looks like what it did.
Which chart are you looking at?
This is chart 14 on page 17 of the monitor. It's the top right corner there.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
In the last year and a half, median wages are up 5%, which is almost as much as they grew during that 10-year period before. And yes, inflation is still a bit higher than that. But what I'm wondering is, as you look at the economy, is wage growth universally bad in your view, or is wage growth good to the extent that it's keeping up with wages? Because historically, wages didn't keep up. And how do you think through that nuance? Because interest rates are a very blunt tool. And if you agree with me that we're now basically in a seller's market for labor, shouldn't we expect and welcome some wage inflation that goes with that?
So I'd say two things. First, we want wages to go up in ways that are consistent over time with the increase in productivity and inflation, and that makes all the sense in the world. The other thing I would say is that in this instance, what we've seen is inflation eating up these very high nominal wage gains have very largely been eaten up by higher inflation. So it's very important that we restore price stability so that we can start to see real wage gains after inflation across the income spectrum.
Yeah, no, and to be clear, we're all opposed to inflation here, but in that 2010 to 2020 period that we all viewed as a very low inflationary period, wages, the gains from productivity did not flow to labor. Wages did not keep up with inflation. And we didn't think about that as a problem for the Fed to fix because overall inflation was down. So, I mean, this gets sort of theoretical, but let's say that we had 6% wage inflation and 5% CPI. There'd be more money in people's pockets, but would we view that as a inflationary period to clamp down on? Because we didn't view the inverse as a problem, if you will.
So our job is to restore price stability and keep price stability. It isn't to keep wages down, and it's certainly not to get involved in trying to establish the appropriate level of labor share of profits, for example. That's not the way we think about it at all. We think about price stability, and when we think about price stability, we think about wages as an important input to that. But we're not targeting a particular level of prices, and we would never say that we don't want real wages to go up. What we're really charged with is price stability, and to do that, we have to think about wages. But in particular, no one at the Fed would be upset to see the labor share go up, but that's not something that our policies affect. That's set by globalization and the advance of technology and educational and skills and aptitude and all those things. That's what drives and productivity. That's what drives labor share.
Yeah, and it's hard to have these conversations in 5 minutes, I realize.
Happy to follow up.
I guess what's hard is that, also in that 2010 to 2020 period, median home prices went up by 50%. Yeah. We didn't view that as inflationary. 401ks went up a lot. We didn't view that as inflationary because those were asset increases. And so as we have shifted the gains from people who had wealth to people who were dependent on wages, there needs to be some correction, and I leave it there because I'm out of time. But how we think about
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you. Go back.
We'll now go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, for 5 minutes.
Thank you for being with us today, Chairman Powell. Chair Powell, I just want to echo at the outset some of the concerns that my colleagues have raised about Vice Chair Michael Barr's, quote, holistic review, unquote, of capital markets, and also about the Fed engaging in climate policy, as well as your decision to put Vice Chair Barr in charge of the Community Reinvestment Act rulemaking. With that said, I'm going to dive right into my questions. Chair Powell, I was pleased to see that the U.S. Coin Task Force released their report on the state of coin a few months ago. The report notes that the Federal Reserve and U.S. Mint will be jointly contracting with a third-party consultant to review the coin supply chain and develop recommendations to improve it. Chairman Powell, could you provide us with an update on what the Fed has learned from its review of the coin circulation issues that occurred during the pandemic?
So we know that the flow of coins, the natural flow of coins in the economy slowed down a lot because people were staying home and that kind of thing, and they may have switched to non-coin-based means of payment. And we feel like that the evidence is that that's continued now. People are paying electronically and things like that, and coins are sitting in jars and on people's desks and at home, and they're not circulating back into the banks and thus to the retail stores. And so we're working on that. We're working with the Mint. We're working with all the stakeholders in the coin ecosystem to try to address this problem, and we're well aware of it.
So it seems to me that what we learned from that is that it's probably necessary to have a greater reserve of coins if there is such an interruption in the future, so that commerce is not indeed interrupted. Would you share that broad view?
That sounds right. I'm not an expert. I will say it feels like we need more coins now because more of them are sitting in people's homes and pockets, and they're not flowing back to where retailers in particular need the flow of coins. So that sounds right to me.
On a related note, could you speak about the importance of maintaining cash as a viable payment option, particularly for those that lack or don't have access to traditional financial services?
We think it's absolutely critical because there are people who don't have credit cards. Many people don't have credit cards. They don't have good credit, and they need to be paying in cash. And when stores are not dealing with people who don't have cash, it's a serious problem for those people in the economy. We have it at the Board of Governors, and you see it elsewhere because most payments are now taken care of by credit cards, and it's very efficient. But we need to be looking out for people who use cash.
Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. Picking up on Mr. Lukemeier's concerns that he expressed earlier, as you know, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's funding mechanism is intricately linked to the Federal Reserve System. According to Title 10 of Dodd-Frank, each quarter the CFPB director requests an amount that is reasonably necessary to carry out the Bureau's authorities, and the Federal Reserve must transfer that amount so long as it does not exceed 12% of the Federal Reserve's total operating expenses. For the first 5 years of the existence of CFPB, of course, there was a relaxation there with respect to that 12% cap that allowed $200 million annually to be spent beyond that number so long as it was reported, so long as the reported excess was sent to the President and congressional appropriators. Chair Powell, during your chairmanship, has the Fed ever rejected a CFPB budget request?
I do not believe so.
And could you tell us what policies and procedures are in place at the Fed to ensure that there is no waste, fraud, or abuse, or that these limits are not otherwise exceeded?
So we have no role in engaging with that. It's really what we share a common inspector general who does work on those issues, but we don't in any way. We don't have any governance of any kind over the CFPB. We're just a source to them.
Thank you. I appreciate that insight. In closing, Chair Powell, yesterday Senator Warren asked you what you would say to the 2 million people who may lose their jobs if the Fed keeps raising interest rates. Frankly, Senator Warren should be asking herself the same question when she voted and advocated for the Democrats' reckless spending packages that caused this inflation that we are seeing today, and is the reason the Fed has had to raise interest rates, in my view. Frankly, I would call on Senator Warren, the President, and the Democratic Party, for that matter, to apologize to the American people for causing this kitchen table crisis across the country. With that, Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Powell, for joining us today and for your testimony. I'm going to focus my comments and my questions on the high costs that families in my district are seeing because of your interest rate hikes. Now, while the Fed has acknowledged that higher interest rates are not the primary driver for the slowdown in price increases, you continue to raise interest rates, risking not only millions of jobs, but also a recession. Based on projections from the Fed, approximately 2 million people will lose their jobs. So that's 2 million families who will struggle to put food on the table, keep a roof over their heads, and to make ends meet. But the economic hardship does not end there. Mr. Chair, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit a recent paper by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland titled Post-COVID Inflation Dynamics into the record.
Without objection.
Chairman Powell, are you familiar with this publication, yes or no?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Well, let me give you some context. In this paper, the Fed's own economists predict that reaching the 2% inflation goal that you have set will be impossible without causing a recession and spiking the unemployment rate to 7.4%, which translates to millions of working people losing their jobs. Now, Chairman Powell, many economists agree with me when I say that engineering a recession to bring inflation under control is not the right strategy, especially at a time when we are seeing inflation cool in real time, independent of your rate hikes. So on behalf of the people of this country, to prevent a recession, yes or no, Chairman Powell, will you pause future interest rate hikes?
We're not seeking to have a recession, and we don't think we need to have a recession to get price stability back.
Will you pause interest rate hikes, yes or no?
I don't do yes or no on will I pause interest rate hikes. Yeah, that's a serious question, and I can't tell you because I don't know all the facts. That's not a
reclaiming my time. And in fact, it is a very serious question because it has a very serious implications. The people who will bear the brunt of an economic recession are our most vulnerable. We know from past experiences that recessions have catastrophic and deeply inequitable consequences. In fact, while some will catch a cold, others will catch pneumonia. But you know that. An economic cold or pneumonia. In fact, in your opening statement, you said, "We will stay the course until the job is done." To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities families and businesses across the country. Could you elaborate, what is this effect to communities, families, and businesses, these interest rate hikes?
Well, right now we're trying to bring down inflation on behalf of all those families. I think high inflation is hurting particularly working families all around the country very badly. And as you know, if you're on a very limited budget and you don't have a lot of excess earnings, when prices start going up, you're in trouble right away. People, middle and upper middle class people have more resources. So we think it's absolutely critical for the working people of this country that we get inflation back under control. And also, while we're at it, we have a dual mandate.
Apologies, Mr. Chair, I'm just reclaiming my time here. Here's the thing. The most devastating impacts will be to our most vulnerable. Veterans to our most vulnerable. Veterans, the elderly, low-income workers, black and brown workers, those who have often ignored and been neglected in the name of what you refer to as appropriate monetary policy. And yet, you assert that you will stay the course. It's unconscionable, and our most vulnerable workers and families cannot afford to wait for you to realize the harm that you were doing. In my opinion, this sounds more like the assertions of a greedy corporation than someone who has a public mission on behalf of the people of this country. One more question with my remaining time here. Chairman Powell, another consequence of your interest rate hikes has been the increase of the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate to 6.6%, double of what it was 2 years ago. Do you see this widening inequity in the housing market as a problem? And what steps will you take to make housing more affordable? This is putting home ownership further and further out of reach for my constituents, new parents, millennials, people of color, contributing to inequities and the racial wealth gap. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, our policies do affect...
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chairs can submit for the record or answer.
I'll briefly say that if I can, that interest rate policies affect interest-sensitive spending very directly. When we cut rates, they help housing. When we raise rates, you see the effect on housing. So
thank you.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Powell, for being with us today. We currently have $32 trillion in debt. Our debt-to-GDP ratio is 120%, the highest it's ever been. And yes, we have a debt ceiling fight brewing for this summer. I would argue it's an opportunity to get our fiscal house in order. But sadly, there's no meaningful bipartisan effort to responsibly address our debt. Both sides have even preemptively started political attacks, alleging either side wants to cut Social Security and health care. But politics and talking points will not fix our problem. Our debt is the greatest national security threat. Social Security will be insolvent in 2033, and our healthcare system is fundamentally broken. We spend twice as much as the average country per person, and our obesity rate is 3 times the average. I want to be clear, though, I'm not advocating cuts to Social Security, but my Social Security will have to be different than my father's, and we must change the incentive structures of our healthcare system. Briefly, let's go over some history. Social Security was created in 1937. The retirement age then was 65, and average life expectancy was 60. Easy to see how that math works. In 1960, Congress raised the retirement age to 67. It has not been increased since then. That year, life expectancy was 69. That math still works due to a growing population, but it's getting narrower. I will throw in another few statistics for that year, 1960. 14% of Americans were obese, and our debt-to-GDP ratio was 53%. Let's fast forward to this year. Our retirement age is still 67, but our life expectancy is 77. That math clearly does not work, nor is the program functioning in the purpose for which it was designed. And shockingly, our obesity rate is 37%, and we spend $13,000 per person on health care compared to the global average of $6,000 per person and 13% obesity rate. Clearly, our healthcare system is failing. Our system focuses on managing sickness where we should be facilitating health and wellness. We will only meaningfully be able to address the debt ceiling by focusing on the biggest drivers of our debt. Responsible policymakers should be focused on saving Social Security by reforming it and transforming our healthcare system to facilitate a healthy citizenry capable of working and being contributing members of society. The American people deserve more than the political nonsense. 5 years ago, the number one issue I ran on was debt. It has been and continues to be our greatest national security risk. I hate to say it, but the last 4 years has gotten way worse. Congress has spent $7 trillion, of which $5 trillion was done mostly on party lines. The Democrat majority has not only spent money we don't have over the last 4 years, but their fiscal policy has caused out-of-control inflation, which caused you to raise interest rates. Last year, I asked you if you ever took into consideration the impact of interest rate increases on the cost of our debt service. You appropriately and adamantly said no. Our debt service cost the next 10 years will be over $10 trillion. I'm going to point out two things. Number one, that is more than all of our debt service since 1940 combined, the last 80 years. And while you did not take interest rate increases impact on our debt service into your decision-making, the best estimate is that those rate increases will increase our debt service cost by $2 trillion in the next 10 years. So basically, the $7 trillion that the Democrats spent in the last 4 years is going to cost us an additional $2 trillion. And that's not factoring in future rate increases as you continue to appropriately try to get inflation under control. As you can tell, this is a huge problem. The $7 trillion in unnecessary spending in the last 4 years has caused inflation. Some of my colleagues across the aisle disagree with that causal relationship. Clinton's Treasury Secretary and Obama's Director of National Economic Council, Larry Summers, wrote an op-ed before they spent the money and said it was going to cause inflation. And he has gone on the I was right tour for the last couple years. We need responsible policymakers to address our debt. Let's talk about what's not serious, and that's minting $1 trillion coin. Many of my colleagues across the aisle have advocated for this. Luckily, both President Biden and Secretary Yellen have said that this is not a serious proposal, and they have no plans of considering it. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has a bit of a history of doing a 180 when the political winds blow. Most recently, he said he would veto the D.C. crime bill, and now he's adamantly supporting it and plans to sign it. So, Chair Powell, my only question of you is if Biden and Yellen send you $1 trillion coin, will you accept it?
What I will say to that is that this only winds up one way, and that is with Congress raising the debt ceiling.
So you will not accept $1 trillion coin and treat it as $1 trillion if it's sent to you?
I'll add there are no rabbits to be pulled out of hats here. This only ends with Congress.
I know you don't like yes or no's, but if you are sent $1 trillion coin and asked to treat it as $1 trillion, will you treat it as $1 trillion?
That would be a rabbit coming out of a hat.
I'll take that as a no. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chair Powell, for being here. You have a lot of economic projections, various data, various reports that are coming out. How much, and you've studied inflation, right? I mean, obviously, it's your number one priority right now. How much is inflation impacted by these three things? Corporate profiteering, egregious executive pay, and the use of stock buybacks.
So I don't have numbers, but I would say in the case of executive pay in the case of share repurchases, I can't think of how it would affect inflation. In the case of executive pay, that would be very small in terms of the broader economy. In terms of profits, though, the way I think about that is profits are high. The places where profits are really high is places where there are shortages and supply chain issues. And as those things get better, as they are, you're going to see inflation come down and even prices come down, and you'll see corporate margins come down there. And that'll be part of how inflation comes down.
So does that corporate profiteering does impact inflation? You don't have any stats of percentage-wise how much of it?
Yeah.
Because you seem, I really paid attention to your testimony in the Senate hearing yesterday, and there was a lot of conversation about, my neighbors and residents' wages and so forth. They're finally starting to see a little bit more closer to possibly getting fair wages. It's not even far enough. But I don't know if the Feds is paying closer attention to monopolies, corporate profiteering, and executive egregious pay. All of it, even the stock buybacks, you're saying all of that aside, you're focused more on wages and increasing the interest rate than on those other
Our focus
major-
is really on price stability, not so much wages. Wages play into that because they're an important cost for business, but they're not. We're not trying to achieve a particular level of wages. We're trying to achieve 2% inflation.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, Chairman, what we saw during the pandemic is, the wealthy and the corporations continued to profit in large scale and still do buybacks and still do really egregious executive pay and benefits and so forth for those at the top. And then, of course, the communities and such were impacted by it. But what I hear consistently is folks thinking that's the reason. All of a sudden wages are skyrocketing, all this. But all I see is continuation, again, of those that are already getting a huge benefit, the folks at the top, the executives and so forth. My friend Glenn taught me this today, that the feds are actually sitting on, something in Dodd-Frank Section 956. You all are sitting on the last 12 years on guidance regarding executive compensation and the high risks of it. Like around, there was some sort of proposal done, not implemented. Again, it's been 12 years. Why is that something that you're not concerned about regarding inflation?
Well,
like you guys are sitting, one, you're sitting on it, right? Why?
Well,
it's been 12 years. And then two, why is that you're saying that's not big deal? That's not going to impact the cost of products and so forth for our residents.
It's a multi-agency rule, and there have been repeated attempts to get 5 or 6 or 7, however many it is, agencies to agree. That's one thing.
On disclosures?
No. This is on. It's on policies to.
Yeah, which include disclosures and arrangements regarding executive pay and the risk of it.
There. Anyway. 956 is. You're right. We haven't been able to get agreement among the agencies, but more to the point, their boards long since. This is just for the big banks where we have this authority. Long since, board of directors are very focused on how executive compensation works and that it not reward, unnecessarily risky behavior and that kinds of things.
Yeah, but in Dodd-Frank, which Congress passed, there should, you're supposed to put something in place, and it's not in place. And look, I'm saying this because so many people in this chamber, and I feel like the feds are more obsessed with wages than they are in regards to the monopolies, the corporate profiteering. There hasn't been any, really, I don't think there is a laser focus on that, and it's really,
All right, Rashida, I think that's enough. The Fed's focus is not corporate profiteering. That's not their function. You guys in Congress can worry about that stuff, and really it's not up to Congress to regulate profits for businesses. Absolutely insane. These leftists are absolutely nuts. So with that in mind, let's do some quick technical analysis here, as we have been live for almost 3 hours now, listening to the Fed chair drone on and on about what essentially amounts to nothing. We can see here at the S&P, futures have remained pretty much flat on the 15-minute basis here. There was a little bit of a move towards the 4,000 area, and really right now we're battling a local point of control here at around 39.90. Would like to see the day close above that level. That would be pretty important. However, the stochastics RSI is not necessarily playing ball with us right now on the 15-minute. We do have stochastics RSI is overbought on the 1 hour. Let's see if the 4 hour is in our favor. And we do have the stochastics RSI is low in this oversold territory. The hope would be to build some momentum off of that, but we do need the lower time frames to cooperate with us right now. And they really don't look like they're playing ball at the moment. Also looks like we may be getting some type of a rejection from Bitcoin from this area here around 22,222. Also not exactly favorable. If we were to see any type of a retest of the breakout of this pattern, I really would not like to see it go any lower than this point of control, which is around 22,010. Okay. So we do still have this trend line here that we can look to for potential support. See if Ethereum's giving us any clues. Really not showing us anything. And it really just looks like it's losing this flag right now after we didn't get much of a move here on this candle. Let's see if the S&P can push back up above this point of control. Once again, this is probably the most important thing that we're going to be looking at. And really this 4,000 level here is psychological resistance, and I would like to see the S&P close the day above that level. Not sure what we can do to regain that momentum right now. So there's just too much FUD, too much talking from the people in Washington when they really should just be trying to get stuff done as opposed to really making it worse, which they are pretty good for. All right, folks, with that in mind, I would like to add a disclaimer that nothing I say or do on this channel should be construed as financial advice. Please get yourself a financial advisor. Do your own due diligence before getting into any investment, coin, or trade. And this is Crypto Clown World. My name is Jason Bruce, your host with the honks. If you're still watching this broadcast, make sure that you honk your like button on the way out. If you haven't, make sure that you're also subscribed to this channel and that you've hit the bell for notifications so that we can bring you new content in a timely manner in the future. And with that in mind, thank you all for joining this broadcast. I do love you out there, and make sure you have yourself a fantastic honking day. And I am out of here.